We are now recording. So again, welcome to Data Articles, What They Are and Why Write One. My name is Tina Griffin. I am an associate professor with the Library of the Health Sciences here in Chicago. And we're going to talk about data articles today. A little bit about me, very briefly. Um, and no, get my meeting controls out of the way there. As I mentioned, I am an associate professor with the library. I'm with the Information Services and Research Department. I am liaison to various departments within the College of Medicine, as well as to the CCTS, as well as the Institute for Juvenile Research. And my research is in research data management education, particularly how people learn data management skills, what they do with them, um, and how they keep them in particular. Um, so I'm interested in that. Come on, slides. There we go. So for today, you do have live transcription available. So if you would like, go ahead and you should have the capability through your Zoom controls to turn your captioning on. This also will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel, and we'll have captions turned on there as well. Feel free to go ahead and either use the chat button or raise your hand to share questions or comments during the presentation. I am happy to stop and answer questions. You don't have to reserve or save your questions until the end or anything like that. Also, please note that because I'm sharing my screen and things like that, I have no visual cues to see you. So I will stop and ask questions from time to time or ask if you have any questions. So if you're nodding your head, I realize most people have their screens off. So I need a thumbs up from the Zoom controls or something through the chat to know that you're interacting with me. So please use those so that I know that you're with me or to slow down or speed up or answer your questions. So if we're good with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Also, I do want to give some credit where credit is due. The idea of data articles and talking about data articles actually came out of a conference that I went to most recently in the Midwest Data Librarians Conference this past fall. And so some of my content, actually a lot of the content here, came from Kate Saylor and their group. And so we're a very collaborative data librarian group. And so a lot of their slides and content came from that. And this is attribution to them um, as they were kind enough to share with me to get the word out about what data papers are and what you can do with them. So what we'll be talking about today is a brief introduction, which we kind of just went through, but also, what are data papers? What do they entail? Um, Also, why would you write one? Where does it fit in some of this in the scholarly landscape, and what does it mean for you? And then the considerations you need to take for writing one. Um, what are the steps that you need to take? So let's get into it. What are data papers? Um, Data papers are an article type that has been increasing in popularity. Data papers have actually been around probably as early as some of the earliest ones have been around since 1959, with American Chemical Society's Journal of Chemical Engineering and Data, as well as Elsevier's Nuclear Data Sheets in 1971. But they kind of had this burst in popularity where data papers really took shape in about 2010. Um, they've been There was a burst of journals coming out right around that time, and they focused on the journals themselves, focused on publishing data papers from about 2010 to 2014. And that was journals focusing just on publishing data papers. Papers that focused on describing data sets, describing data in and of itself, not methods papers where you describe how you did something for the purposes of describing a new technique, for example, and not a research article where you're reporting results, but actually a data article. Um, and so these are just a few examples. These articles also kind of pop up, not necessarily in strictly data journals, but they also are a data article that can be found in what might be called a traditional journal, where they publish various other types of research articles, editorials, reviews, your hypothesis or position paper research articles that you would normally see, and they're now adding on a data article as a type. And that's kind of what you see here is in various journals, Solar Energy, Journal of Soil Science, or the Journal of Geosynthesis and Ground Engineering have decided that they're going to actually start accepting this new article type of a data article or a data paper. So they've been around for a while. Um, and, a description of them would be something that describes a data set and provides information on, the who, what, where, and why of the data. And it contains a link back to a DOI, which would link you to the data set itself, which would be held in a repository. And it would also link to the journal publisher, potentially, that had the research article where the results were, where you actually talked about the paper. So it's kind of a bridge between a couple of different things. Um, we know that sometimes research articles and their methods, you can have a really interesting or robust data set or data, and the paper focuses on the data, but the data collection or the data in and of itself might have been big or complicated or have a lot of data, and the method sections don't really adequately describe what went into it. Method section can kind of be a hot mess. But the data itself, when you go look at the data, if you were to go to the repository or things like that, that's just the data. It's the data files. It might have a README document, it might not. The metadata itself just tells you what it is, but doesn't give you a whole lot of context. And the paper focuses on the results, the implication, the description of, what it means to science, but not necessarily anything else. So a data paper can kind of bridge that gap where it actually describes the data set itself, the collection of it, and various other things. So what is it? The data paper is the description of the research data set. It describes its collection. It can describe its potential for reuse. It's usually on a curated data set. And what we mean by that is something that is in a form that is usable and valuable to others. It is deposited specifically in a repository that is accessible. Um, and it focuses on data that's potentially collected throughout a research life cycle. So it is something that could support either a single project or a set of projects. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but it often is. But it does not provide the data set itself, and it does not describe novel results. Like I mentioned in previous slides, the data set's in the repository, and the novel results is usually described in an article, in a research article. Data papers can be called a number of different things depending on the journal and what the journal decides to call it. It can be a data article, a report, a brief, a note, a data description. There's a lot of different words for this, which can sometimes make it a little bit difficult for them to find. But they're out there, and a lot of people are starting to write more and more of these. So, digging a little deeper, how do these compare to your standard research-based articles? Data papers are usually shorter and they're much, much more descriptive. They can have some common article components. They have titles, abstracts, backgrounds, and methods. And they do have links out to supporting information like appendices, things like that, disclosures about financial contributions, things like that, DOIs. But they also have some specific information. They'll have usage notes, links to code. They will have an expanded collection methods. And they'll also very much describe validation, how the data was validated, often, not always, but things like that. Also, many data journals, and we're talking about journals that are data specific, but also other mixed journals, the journals that have more than just data articles in them, but more traditional journals. Both types can be peer reviewed. Um, so it's good to know whether or not these are peer reviewed or not. If you choose to write one of these, that's something you'll have to investigate, whether or not that's important to you. Um, so as a comparison, if we just look at the sections within an article, if you see here on the left, a research-based article from BMC Health, and this would be just for example, this is from the same article. This is author Bayan, The Impact of Food Security on Health Outcomes. The research article on the left has your abstract and in your standard MRAD format. So you have your background, methods, results, discussion. It does have an availability of data and materials, and that's where it's going to actually refer to the data article on the right, as well as the data set itself, which would be in a repository. And then you get into abbreviations, references, acknowledgments, and funding, which is all your standard things that BMC as a format, what they require in their journals, the author information, ethics, supplementary rights, things like that. And then within the data article itself, which is in BMC Research Notes, this article is the data set of the impact of food security on health outcomes. So this is the data article that goes with that article. Here you can actually see the subject sections are a little bit different, but very much in parallel. So you have objectives of the data article, and then you get into data descriptions, the limitations, again, availability of data materials, which points to repository and things like that. But then you get into abbreviations, references, acknowledgments, and all the standard things that BMC has as their traditional sites, sections within their articles. So they're very similar in format, but you can see it's probably kind of shorter and where they spend their time, right? Method sections and research articles tend to be shorter, and the article itself spends a lot of time on results and discussion, where here the data description is probably the biggest part of the article. And overall, the article is probably shorter. But again, that was BMC as an example. When we talk about what should get reported in a data article, Kim in 2020 looked at a variety of different article data journals and various other places that take data articles and looked at what type of things do they want to see in their data articles. And they grouped these into a number of different categories. And so the next two or three slides talk about, what do they want to see in a data article? What do they want to see reported out? And this first one talks about data properties, and they look across a variety of different journals here, in a variety of different subjects. But what I wanted to point out here was, in this case, what are the data properties that get reported? And the journals are free to report on, a number of different things of what they want to see. So here we're looking at data properties about the data itself. Like, when was the data created? What format is it in? What type of data is it? Is there versions of the data, file types and names and file sizes and languages and things like that? And you'll notice that for the example that we just used, BMC, they don't require any of that in their reporting. But the Journal of Open Archaeology Data, which is this last column, requires almost all of it. um, in their template and their guideline. So there's a variety of different things that different articles want to get reported or different things that they think should be reported in papers. And this is just for data properties. On the next slide, we can look at who produces the data. And you'll see across the board, this is where most journals are more concerned is, who's producing the data, what goes into data production. Here, more journals are interested in the data collection specifics. They want to know about the specimens and artifacts and who's producing them and how the data was analyzed and what happened with missing data and, what were the research objectives? Why did you collect this data? What was the context of it, associated projects with it and things like that. Because that context is really important to, can it be reused or what was the meaning behind it? That makes a lot of sense or makes the data make sense, which is super important. So the data production seems to be pretty consistent across a lot of the data journals or journals that accept data, um, as well as a lot of repository information is pretty information. Almost all of them want provenance, right? They want to know what repository and where it is. Everybody wants to know that. They care maybe a little less about repository reputation or history. Repositories are they kind of are developing all the time with more data sharing mandates that come up. And some of the curation and digitization processes are also evolving all the time, so they're not less concerned with some of those things. But they are very involving data reuse information. Almost all of them want some sort of terms of use and advice on reuse. They're less concerned about prior reuse. But these are the kind of things they want to know if you're going to write a data paper. They want to know about, how can people use the data and where it is, basically. So speaking of repositories, then, how are data papers and all this work different than just putting the data in a repository, right? Why go to the effort of writing a data paper? And data papers actually describe the data. Um, it is very descriptive of the data set itself. It goes back to that quote we had in the beginning. It describes who and what and where and how, and it's very narrative in sense. Well, the data repositories actually hold the data. When you go to a data repository, if you haven't done that before, what you're really getting is the files. The repository will get a file and you might get some README documentation, but that's likely all you're going to get. You're going to get this is what it is, and it will probably just refer you back to the original research article. Or it might give you a copy, a preprint copy or postprint copy of the article in there as well. But that's it. You're not going to probably get a lot of context around it beyond that. And the article may give you a lot of context, but typically it doesn't. You're going to get DOIs with that. Almost everything will mint a DOI these days. Repositories are designed to do that. But with the repository itself, you're just going to get an Excel sheet or a data file or a transcript file or whatever it is. You're just going to get the data, raw or processed, whatever they've deposited in there. But you're not going to get any kind of meaning behind the data. So there tends to be a gap within that. So let's look at a few examples. This is that one that I referred to earlier when we had that side-by-side comparison, the impact of food security on health outcomes by Bayan. This is published in BMC Health. So this is actually the research article on that was published for BMC Health. And then this is actually the data note. So this was published through BMC Research Notes. It's published, the article type is a data note. So this is actually a data paper. And then this actually describes the availability of data materials, which is available in Um, this one is available in Springer Nature. It looks like it's in their repository. It's linked to a repository in Springer Nature. Oh no, this looks like Figshare. Um, yes, this is Figshare. So they deposited their data in Figshare, and so this is actually in the repository, and this is the data set that you get in Figshare. So you can see the difference between the article actually talks about the research and the findings. The data note talks about the data itself and what the data looks like and how they collected it and what's in it. And then you actually get the data set, which is here. So this is kind of a public health one. Here's one that's a little bit, this is a psychology one. Impact of syllabus frequency in handwriting and picture naming. I'm not sure what that is, but this is the research article for that. It's a Bayesian analysis. And the data paper from here was published in Open Psychology Data. So this is the data paper. And then the corresponding data set was published in OSF. Now here it's interesting because if you look down here, if you can see my cursor on the bottom, you can actually see that the OSF, they have all the appendices, and they actually published a version of their data paper actually in OSF itself as well. So they have the data paper in here as well as the data sets in it. And you'll notice the description as well. They do actually, the data is available on OSF with the title of the project, the link to the project, and the specific folder names and the DOIs. Notice that when they actually give their description of their data sets, they're actually giving very, very complete titles, DOIs, and links. They're not just saying, well, just go look in the article. Okay. I want to point that out here because I'm going to mention that again later. And here's the last one, American Journal of Preventative Medicine. This is talking about firearm suicide proxy and gun ownerships. So this is the article. Here is the data brief, or an article. This is the data paper and data brief. That's the type. And this is the journal. And notice everything has had DOIs this entire time as well. And the data availability here, this data is housed in Dataverse. So you can get at the data set through Dataverse, and everything is going from one to the other. Now, I have been going from the paper to the data paper to the data set, but you can actually do the reverse. You should be able to go from the data set, and the last example is a good one here. I'm not actually clicking into any of these things, but you can click into these. And within the descriptions, you should be able to also go from the data papers, or start from anywhere within these and go to any other set, right? So the research article, the data article, and the data set should all cite one another. We typically think of the research article first, but that's not necessarily always the case. The research article and the data paper should cite each other in the references section as well as the data availability section. But the data set itself should also cite both of those research articles and the data paper in their citations and related materials, or depending on where the repository is set up, there's places to make sure that they are citing to their corresponding fields. So let me stop there for a moment. What questions do you have before I go on to a very brief segment of why would you want to publish a data article? Remember, go ahead and unmute yourself or put it in the chat. What questions can I answer right now? Okay, not hearing any. I'm going to keep moving on. So, this is actually fairly brief. Why would we want to publish a data article? Um, One of the reasons is if you're going to the effort of creating all this data, um, our research that we do as being in an R1 research institution, a lot of our metrics, and a lot of our effort in being at a research institution goes toward publication, publication, publication. Like we know this. But making your data more discoverable and better positioned for reuse is also a metric, right? This is something that can help you get your data and your research out there to be seen and to be used. So publishing a data article is something that, reinforces that triangle. If something goes into a repository but it can't be seen, this is another thing that goes into that publication cycle that also points to things. And it points to both the article and the data sets. The more things that are out there, the more it reinforces the data that's there. And, if the project is fairly large, or even if it's not that large, um, visibility it can be a good thing. It can showcase, the type of work you're doing, or it can showcase a program, it can showcase, the impacts that things are having because data does tell a story. Um, and people can use that data to tell their own stories. And increasingly, science is expensive, but we'll get that. We'll get to that as well. Um, Jason, yes.
I was going to say that Anita had a question about
Oh,
what's
yeah.
the main motivation to write a data paper, but I think that's kind of what you're describing right now.
Yes, it is. I'm actually getting, yeah, into some of that. And everybody's motivations, I think, are very personal, right? Because some people might be on a clinical track or a tenure track, and so their motivations are publish, publish, publish. Some people's motivations are, I did all this work, and now what do I do with all this data? Can I do anything else with it? Can I get some more value out of it? This would be one way to get more value out of it instead of just having it sit on a hard drive somewhere. Increasing that visibility um, can get you more citations. It can get you more scholarly output. Um, that, because data sets can be cited, research data articles can be cited, all of those things can go into this. And because they refer to each other, they are also reinforcing um, and showcasing your work as a scientist. When I went up for tenure, I cited my data sets. I put my data sets into the repository here at Indigo and I cited them. And because they didn't have data sets about some of the things that I was doing with learners and data management and things like that. So, or at least they didn't have them with the data elements that I was publishing. A lot of them were doing data sets on institutional metrics like how many full-time students or how many grants or things like that. And I was like, well, that's great, but you could be looking at these other factors as well. And they were like, I didn't find those metrics that compelling. They might be compelling to like administrators, but for people who are teaching data management and have this as a job responsibility, which increasingly those of us do, um, it's not that useful. So I wanted to put it out there and I put it into my dossier. And it does get cited. My papers do get cited and they refer to one another and they get cited. So it was useful for me in my tenure packet. But if you're not doing it for, tenure and promotion reasons, it does also help just promote the research itself and just what the research and the impact of the research gets accomplished. So, um, and for you to put all that effort into getting data and putting it out there and just getting more use out of it. Also, these days it's harder and harder to get research money. Um, And so getting the most out of the data for just the research community in general is valuable. to have out there. To have the data out there and have it in a repository and then being able to describe it so other people can use it, even if it's just yourself in the future, where someone else can take care of the data and you can come back and access it again is also valuable as well. Another thing that I haven't touched on is that almost everybody has to have some sort of research funding in order to do science these days. And increasingly, having the research funding comes with data management sharing expectations. And so either the journals are asking for it, the funders are asking for it. So a lot of times in those research sharing expectations, you have to deposit the data anyway. So this is why we're seeing so much data going into repositories. And so having the data paper explaining the data is just one more piece where it's like, well, if the data has some sort of value to it and we have to deposit the data anyway, and I'm going to go into when you might or might not want to write the data article that's coming up in a couple of slides, um, then you can meet those data management expectations by the funder or the journal or whoever's asking for that, and then get the extra citations or get the extra visibility out of it anyway. Does that answer your question? I might have over answered it, maybe. I hope. Yes? Okay. I'm going to move on. I do want to point out that the number of like I kind of touched on this in a little bit earlier, but the number of data papers or the journals that are publishing data papers, whether they're the mixed journals or dedicated journals, is increasing. This is just a snapshot in this data collection. This paper was done in 2024. Um, this is the number of data papers published per year from 1980 to 2019. These are just increasing, right? People are publishing these journals. They're describing the databases. Those are the PDBs. That's that yellowish straight unaccented line. And then the data sets, which is describing data sets, describing so you could describe a data paper, you could describe a database, you could describe a data set. Um, that's that pink line with the boxes. Um, and these are only increasing. Um, People writing more and more of them, and the number of data publications, the number of places that you can publish this is only increasing. We're getting to the point of where this is just becoming a very common genre to be writing in. Um, it's not quite at the numbers of traditional journal publications that's still vastly outstripping this. Nobody's done quite this one-to-one comparison, but it's, we're in the thousands in terms of the number of papers and things like that per year that we're publishing on these things. So this isn't really a small niche thing anymore that's happening out there. My guess is that the driver on this is, the data sharing mandates that are out there and people wanting to get everything they can from the work that they're doing and getting the visibility that they can from the work that they're doing. So just to put a little bit of that into perspective, that this is not just um, a niche thing out there. It is getting adopted by journals. It is getting adopted by a number of different places, and it is only increasing at this point. So there is a lot of options out there for people to write data papers. So how do we do this? If this is something that you're interested in, is something that you want to do, um, there's basically pretty straightforward steps to actually writing a data paper. One, you have to deposit your data somewhere. And if you have funder requirements, you're going to have to do this anyway. So, you have to deposit your data. So you have to figure out, should you be sharing your data, finding a repository and getting your identifier. And then you cross-state cite your data with your articles. So if you've already published the research articles, you have your DOI for that. You publish, you deposit your data, you get your DOI from that. You write your data article and you get your DOI from that. So you should have at least three DOIs or identifiers, and they all refer to one another. So it goes back to that triangle we talked about. And we just choose the right journal and make sure that everybody refers to one another, and you're on the right path. So let's talk about, should you actually share the data? Um, and in a lot of cases, you don't have to check off all of these boxes, but you want to at least run yourself through this list. Can you make or do you have good documentation about how you collected this data? Do you remember what you did? Did you write everything down? Do you know the who, what, where, when, and why, and how you did everything? Can you turn that into good documentation? If you did things with human subjects, did you ethically collect it with consent? Now, that's not just consent to do the research, but did you also get consent to share? And if you did not get consent to share, can you go back and get consent to share? Because if you did not, then maybe you can't share the data. Um, is there an accessible repository for this data? Um, and if there is an accessible repository, which there almost always is at this point, that's less of an issue than it used to be. But there is still things that might be an issue in terms of, individual file sizes or total file sizes. If you have data that's really, really large or a total file size that's really large, that might be an issue. Or particular file types, that might be an issue that makes it inaccessible. You might need to consider conversion or whether or not it needs to be broken down or things like that. So, um, security measures. So if you are working with something like human subject data and you're still required to do some sharing, it might be the case where you have to do something like anonymize all your data if it's possible. And if it's not possible, you might want to consider doing a metadata only record where you can't actually share the data, or you deposit the data, but the data is suppressed. And there's a metadata only record, but that's it. Or you can share it, but then you have to have a data use agreement and people can access it, but only if they have certain security protocols or various other things in place where they can access the data, but then they have to sign agreements and then they can only take the data for this purpose and this type, things like that. So it is possible, we're past the days where you can be like, well, human subjects can't do anything. But it's very much on a case by case basis. It depends on where that data goes, things like that. Reusable and interoperable. A lot of times this refers to the FAIR principles. We can help you with the FAIR principles and making sure that your data is interoperable to some degree. Like, we're not data scientists. A lot of this is whether or not it can be machine readable or not. But the FAIR principles are very much embedded into a lot of repositories. So if you choose your repository, and we're going to get into that next, they walk you through what you need to do to just deposit the data. And a lot of times it has to do with having it a file type or converting it to a file type. So that is a lot of the cases of what it has, as well as things like reasonable file names. And describing things well. So it is very manageable to do things like that. Is the data significant and notable? Like, we're not at the point where we need to deposit every single data set for every little thing. Nobody has storage capacity for all of that. So we do want to maybe pick and choose about what data sets we want to put in. We don't need to be writing data papers about absolutely everything. But at this point, think about what could be interesting for the scientific community. And it's not exclusively what could be significant or novel. Sometimes what is interesting is also what contributes to reproducibility as well. So consider that if you're adding something that maybe isn't novel but contributes to something that is well known, but is a smaller data set and can add to a smaller data set to make it larger, but confirms reproducibility or replication, that would be valuable as well. And again, we discussed funder and journal mandates, so I'm not going to reiterate that anymore. So if you've checked off most of those, then at this point it's time to look for a repository, and we can also help you with that. You want to look for something that has similar data sets in it. It has something in place for preservation and background backup. Um, it includes options for access restrictions if you may need those. It attaches some sort of license for the data set. So in this case, we're talking about things like, does it offer a Creative Commons license? Um, does it put an embargo on it if it needs to have an embargo on it? Are there other licensing options? Does it put a data use agreement on it? Um, you can also consult the Office of Research here at the university. There is an office that deals with data licensing, and you should consult them about data use and data licensing as you're putting things into data sets, if you're planning on going this route. Um, but for the most part, your general data sets you should be able to put into repositories and attach a CC0 license to it. Um, the Office of Research is really concerned with things that might be proprietary, um, or things that they could come in conflict with grant requirements or things like that. So that would be the only reason that you would want to check with them. But I want to do due diligence by mentioning that at least. You also want to have procedures for migration of storage and technologies. You want to make sure that like these repositories are maintained in some sense, they're not static, that they're actively being managed. And you want to be aware of it if there's any costs involved. Some of them do, some of them don't. Are there costs that is it a single thing? Is it something that you have to actively maintain? Things like that. There are a few general repository options. So these are repositories that don't have like a subject specific or a file type, or they don't take specific subject specific or file type specific data. UIC is our Indigo is our repository for the university. So we do take file types up to a specific size, and we take any type of data. ICPSR, we also help deposit into ICPSR. We are an ICPSR member. But OSF is also an option. Zenodo, Dataverse, NIH repositories are also there as well. You can also go to our data management and sharing guide. Uh, Jason, if you want to drop that into our chat for everybody, the data management and sharing guide has links in there about and a number of different options if you want to go to subject specific guides. There's also Re3 Data, which is a repository finder if you want to find a repository that is more subject specific. Your journal selection might also have that in there as well. And if you do have an NIH or an NSF funded guide within the data management and sharing guides in our data management section, we do have some specific guidance if you're funded by them about what some of those requirements for data management and sharing might be. I'm not going to go into a specific how to put things in a repository because all the repositories are a little different. It very much depends on the type of data you have and what the repository requirements are. So there's so much variability in that, but every repository has guidelines, walkthroughs, and/or videos. And if you run into a specific thing with a repository, we'll go ahead and we're happy to help you figure that out. You can make an appointment with us and we'll walk you through or help you figure out what you need for a particular repository. So, but in any case, as you're going through that process, make sure that you get your DOI assigned. So these will happen when you do the data repository, whatever repository you pick, there'll always be the option, and this is true in UIC's Indigo as well, when you put it into the repository. And then the data paper and the research article should automatically get persistent identifiers in their DOIs as they go through that process. So, um, what I mentioned before, I will mention again. What you don't want to do is you don't want to do this. You don't want to be like, the data sets can be found in online repositories, right? As you're writing any of the papers or the data articles or whatever you have, or even if you're in the data set itself and you're depositing that research data, this is so generically written as to not be useful. Um, you want to do what we saw in the previous examples was you want to be specific on naming things where they are. It's in this repository. Here are the links. This is the file names. This is the project names, stuff like this. So as you're depositing things, whether it's in the article, whether it's the paper, whether it's the data paper, wherever you're doing it, you want to make sure that everything is very clear about where all of the things are. Um, Make sure that you're actually citing things the way that they're supposed to be citing. And if you're not the data creator specifically, that's fine. Citing the data set or citing data is very similar to citing a journal article. Um, we do have that on that research data guide that we're going to put in chat. Um, Citing data it's got the same or very common elements to citing anything else that's in there. So just putting that in there as a side. Um, yeah, I'll leave it at that. It's pretty much the same as citing a journal article these days. So I wanna leave it there. I want to pause for a minute. This is about choosing repositories and um, getting your data into a repository, the types of things that you had to think about putting data into a repository and getting your data prepared for that. The next thing I'm going to talk about is choosing a journal, and we'll take a look at a data paper to wrap it up. So I want to give everybody a chance to answer any questions we might have at this point. Check our chat here.
I had a question. So
Yes,
can
please.
anybody write a data paper, or is this something that happens through invitation, or is it varies by journal?
So thank you for that segue. Um, oh, come on. Uh, yes, please go to next slide. Um, so anybody really can write a data paper. Um, but some journals might do it by invitation. Um, Most of the ones I'm aware of, you can just write them. So like scientific data, you can just write one and send it off. But a lot of them have peer review, like we talked about before. So you're sending it off for peer review. And they're gonna look at it, they're gonna ask some questions about, making sure you have all of your ducks in a row, and making sure you have that it makes sense. And they're gonna have your normal peer review questions as you go through the process. But you do want to check like the audience and the scope of the journal before you submit to it. You want to check all of the things that you would normally do for submitting to a journal before you would do it. But yes, anybody can submit and write a data paper. Um, and in some cases it could be a really good thing for students to do too, is write the data paper because there are a lot of um, producing a lot of the data as well. So and it's a lot of the methods involved in this. And we're going to take a look at a paper to see what that looks like. Um, but you do want to choose the right journal. Um, you want to make sure they actually publish data articles. We do want to pay attention to the impact factor of reputation. We want to make sure that we're actually publishing in a journal and not a predatory publisher. And keep in mind that, some of them are dedicated data journals or mixed journals that publish data papers in addition to others. There's really no difference. It's more your preference of where you want your article to go. Um, whether you want it in like a dedicated data journal or if you want to try to put it in like, BMC data notes or what have you. Come on, I want to advance. There we go. Here's a selection of dedicated data journals. You can see there's all types out here. We've mentioned a few of them today: open psychology data, scientific data, BMC research notes. But there's a lot of other ones that are out there that'll publish, and it's up to the journal whether or not they take them on solicitation or whether or not they take them on as open. It's really up to the journal. This is just an example from scientific data. This is when you go to them, you can go to them and they have theirs in collections, and you can see which collection goes to fit. Like, here's data sets for gait analysis, data structures and ontologies for clinical and medical research, human microbiomes and metagenomics. And you can go through and see, and then they have here are their aims and scope, and see what works for that. The other way to find data journals, because again, there's a lot of them out there, or journals that publish data, is actually to search for them. And there's a couple ways to do this, is you can just do a general search. And again, here we want to do a very crude keyword search, right? You want to look for, like a particular cancer type if you have a cancer data or something like that. And then filter by, for example, if there's a filter type for data papers, data articles, something like that, as you would see in Scopus, they have one for data papers. Or in PubMed, for example, you can filter for data set. And that's going to give you like the data papers, right? So this one, I cut it off, unfortunately. It says scientific data, the article we were just looking at, the journal we were just looking at, says scientific data. So here, this is how you kind of pull some of that up. And then you can find the journals that are pulling up that kind of research. And that will give you a journal list of places that are publishing on the type of data that you would want to write a data paper about. The other way to do it, again, this is in Scopus, but you could do this in any of the journal database or in the databases, would be to do a title search, and you would run a keyword search for data article, data note, data description. You would literally run a search for those terms just like that. And then you would do that and whatever your term of interest would be, right? And you would combine those two searches together. And that would also bring you up a list of results of journals that publish data papers on that topic. And then again, go to that journal and find out how do you submit to that journal. So that was a couple of other ways to find how do you publish for places like that. And then when you go to actually write the articles, it's very similar to writing your normal research articles. You want some clear and concise title and abstract. You want to make it clear that you're actually writing a data article, not a research article, right? The focus is going to be on not the results, but the description of the data. And you want to focus more on the introduction and the background of contextualizing the data. You don't want to be focusing on, explaining the results, explaining the data. That's the research article, right? You got to bring yourself out of that and pull yourself into describing the data. Explain the methods in the data collection. You want to explain your data set and your variables and forms. And again, the journal itself, if you read a few examples and you look at what their requirements are, they'll tell you what they want. But you also want to do things like discuss potential uses, or how to reuse your data. Obviously, you're going to have your DOI, citations to relevant publications, as well as any licensing information, reuse limitations, things like that. So let's take a look at one. We can pull up this. I'm going to put this in the chat. Nope, I'm not going to pull this up in the chat because it's just wanting to do this. Let me go back. I'm going to drop this. Come on. There we go. And drop this into a chat because this will take us, this is open access. Come on. Oh, goodness. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I did this morning with no issues. Okay, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna do it this way. Because it's right here. This is open access. Everybody should be able to get a hold of it. You can read it on HTML. Nobody has to download a paper or anything. You can if you'd like. But we're going to take a look at this paper. This is a scientific data paper. It's a data descriptor paper. Oh, we only have a couple minutes. But I want you to take a quick look at it and have some thoughts about it. And then we'll go ahead and um, wrap up. Is everyone able to access it okay? Okay. I know we're at time. I know I have not given you full time to look at this, but what are your first impressions? Um, I've given us a selection of questions here. So feel free to address any of these questions, or if there's another question that kind of occurred to you, what are your first thoughts about this data paper? And again, go ahead and unmute or chat either way.
I think just scrolling to the end at least, it looks like it does a good job of explaining any competing interests or, acknowledging the funding, and it has a lot of that information you want to see, like for how that data was like created.
It does. It does a really good job of describing the data set. It does a really good job of validation as well. It does a really good job there. Anita, Ross, do you have any opinions? Not hearing anything quite yet. Okay. A couple of things. It seems like ethical, what they had was consent, and consent to share, which I think was great that that was in there. And they did a good job of anonymizing participants, and the whole purpose of doing some of this was actually to share this data. That was thought of from the beginning, which I thought was great. Um, where I found it a little bit more confusing and what I would have liked clarity on is there is a license applied to the data set, but it's a little unclear, and this is partially because of the journal, is that there's a CC0 license applied to the article. If we go down to the article at the bottom, it says CC0, and that makes it sound like, oh, okay, so I can use whatever I want out of the data. But as it turns out, that was if you read it, it says it's CC0 on the article. It's not the data set. And it actually does take a little bit of work to find the data set itself. So if you go through in here, the only thing it says is that, this is providing data raw and ready to use for the community. And we're like, okay. But when we actually go to find the data, you go to data records and it says that it tells you exactly where it is. The data set is available in the online Figshare repository. So, but it's connected to the literature. So it's actually here in this gate modification change to lower. So this is actually linked to an article. So if we click to 41, data set, okay, so it goes here, it goes to the data sets. So data sets of walking, so we have 4 different data sets, and then it actually takes you to Figshare. And then if we go to Figshare, we now find Figshare, and here's the data set. And then the Figshare data set has a license CC by 4. It's CC by 4.0. So if you click on this, then it can tell you what you can do with the data. You are free to share, you're free to adapt as long as you give attribution and you have no additional restrictions. So this is actually what we can do with the data, because we're here at the data. But what we saw in the article was the license in the article, rights and permissions. This article is licensed under a CC attribution non-commercial 4.0. So the article is non-commercial, no derivatives, but the data itself is not. And then you have your code availability and all that kind of stuff. So it can be a little misleading to do this for the first time. So the article has a no derivatives on it, but the data itself does not. So it takes a little navigation to do things like that, but and that might just be the article. But it's something worthwhile to kind of figure out. So um so in summary, let me go back to my screen here. Data papers report and describe a data set in and of themselves, but they don't provide the data. Data papers are considered a scholarly object like research papers, and they can be cited like one. And then data papers and research papers and the data set ideally refer to each other and can help with research discovery and dissemination and things like that. So if there's any other questions, I'm more than happy to stay on. I realize that we're a couple minutes over. We would very much appreciate an evaluation for today's session. I will come back to this slide in just a second. Our next topic would be researching topics of oppression. That is going to be by Emily Gilbert tomorrow and explores how do you research topics of oppression and search strategies for that. You can find that at the same place that you found our landing page. And that's going to be tomorrow at the same time, 11 o'clock. But I very much appreciate you showing up to today's webinar. Again, the recording will be on YouTube and in the coming weeks. And I appreciate your time and attention today. And if you have any questions, I'm going to stop recording, but I appreciate if you would fill out an evaluation for today. And thank you so much.